Dry shade is considered to be one of the most difficult parts of the garden to buy plants for, but there are actually hundreds of plants that will do well in dry shade. So it's also a question of finding out what the questions are that you need to ask yourself in order to narrow down those choices and find exactly the right dry shade plants for your garden. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'll put links to any resources we mention and plant names in the description below. And if you're new here, the Middlesized Garden uploads weekly with tips, ideas and inspiration for your garden. So if you'd like to see the videos when you open up YouTube, tap the subscribe button, and if you'd like YouTube to tell you when a new video is uploaded, tap the notifications bell. Firstly, what is dry shade? If you've got a wall, I've got a walled garden, and if you've got trees, then anything you plant near there will be in the shade and it's likely to be quite dry. The base of a wall can be very dry depending on the prevailing wind as to whether the rain is being driven into the wall or actually is sheltering it from the wall, but the base of a wall can be an extremely dry place to plant plants. And if your wall and trees are south facing in the northern hemisphere or north facing in the southern hemisphere, then actually they will have some sun. But if they're the other way round, if they're completely shady and facing in the most shady direction, then really you have to be quite strict with yourself about choosing plants that really will thrive in shade. Here is a little triangle between two paths in my garden, and when I originally designed this 11 years ago, I thought it would be wonderful to have great big rhubarb leaves covering the whole area, so it would be a lovely contrast to the viburnum leaves behind it. Well, of course, I had completely ignored the fact that because there are several mature trees in this area, it'll be dry shade, and rhubarb likes moist sun. I mean, you couldn't really do worse. So the rhubarb never spread, and what that meant is that the ground was always very weedy because bare earth attracts weeds. So we've dug up the rhubarb, and as you can see, Lottie is checking it out for us. This earth is so dry, it's almost like dust, and we have had rain recently. The Middlesized Gardens in southeast England, so we roughly equate to a USDA hardiness zone of 9 because our winters are very mild, but of course our summers aren't as hot, and we have very low rainfall, just 26 inches a year, which is like 66 centimetres. So you can see that this little patch is going to be quite challenging to plant. So the first thing I ask myself, and which you have to ask yourself, is what style or effect do you want? If you have a particular garden style, and I've got a 12 garden styles video which I'll put in the description below, but if you have a particular garden style, you may want to make sure your little dry patch fits in with that. Or if it's in a slightly sealed off part of the garden, you might want to go different. Either will work, it's just a question of thinking about it. And I would say that my garden style, although this is a walled town garden, is broadly traditional English country. And I think that directs it, and I think that in that case what I will do is go for a sort of mini woodland area, because I think that fits with the general style of the garden. The next thing to do is to look at your dry shady spot from all angles, because that'll help you decide what height plant you want and whether you want evergreen or you want deciduous that will lose its leaves in the winter. It also will help you decide if you want tall plants, whether you want a gradation of plants, you know, tall at the back and small at the front, or whether you want to keep it fairly low. I can see this path from several windows in the house, and I really like the curve of it, and I don't want to cover that up. Additionally, this area looks lovely in spring when all the bulbs come up. It's when it really sparkles. So I don't want to put big evergreen plants in here because that will cover up the bulbs. And it may also hide the line of the path. So once again, by looking at it from all angles, both from the house and all around the garden, that's helped me realise that actually I want quite low plants in there, and that fits quite well with a sort of mini woodland feel. If, for example, you had a dry shady area and you wanted to screen things, you'd want a much bigger, blockier, evergreen plants in there. The next thing to consider is what sort of a gardener you are. I once visited Sandhill Farmhouse, which is the home of Rosemary Alexander, who runs the English Gardening School, and she had a brick path between two high walls, so it was dry and it was shady, and she'd lined it with ferns, and it just looked fantastic. It was just one single plant in there. And of course that could work very well in a triangle. You just fill it with ferns or perhaps with Bergenia. But the fact of the matter is, I'm not that sort of a gardener. I'm not a tidy gardener. I have to say I admire tidy gardeners hugely because I often think it looks so brilliant. But I know that if something self-seeds and I think it's pretty, I'm never going to pull it up, or I'm just simply going to be a bit distracted and forget to pull it up. So I think that big blocks of one thing are probably not right for me, but they may be right for you. The next thing is to look at what you've already got that's doing quite well in your darker, shadier corners. You may find that there is some pulmonaria under a tree that's doing quite well. You may find ivy. You may find things that do well in your area, or of course visit a neighbour's garden. Posy Gentles lives quite near to me. I've always admired the way she grows Astrantias and Saxifrage London Pride together. But if I look up Astrantias online, it says that they like moist conditions. Well, Posy's given me some Astrantias and I've planted it in a dry, shady part of my garden, in my dry, shady, difficult corner. And it's doing fine there. So that brings me to my next point, which is check several websites and cross-check with the label when you're choosing plants, because labels are often a little bit vague. It's very rare for a label to be as specific as to say for a dry, shady corner. And the websites do vary enormously, which may be about the fact that they're in different parts of the world, or it may be that people have different experiences. But for example, I've seen both hostas and hydrangeas recommended for dry, shady spots, and both of those generally do quite like moisture. However, Hydrangea quercifolia, or the oak leaf hydrangea, it's known to be more drought resistant than most hydrangeas, and Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle also does well in our north-facing border beside a wall and near some evergreen trees. So it's a question of trial and error, and of course I've always said gardeners learn by trial and error, and I've even got the t-shirt. And so sometimes it's worth experimenting. It's really worth doing the research and then taking a risk. And sometimes it won't work out, but of course you may get some wonderful unexpected successes. In terms of specific plants, there's, as I said, Astrantia, which is delicately pretty and it's worth a try. It's hardy in quite a wide range of zones. Astrantias are often recommended for planting under trees, although usually people add that they like moist soils. And of course it's very rarely moist under a tree unless you've got a river nearby. Then there's Aucuba japonica. If you're wanting a big evergreen, it's probably, in the UK certainly, the least fashionable plant at the moment. But its yellow spotted leaves do make a little bit of light in a dark corner. It's evergreen and it doesn't require much attention. It's less hardy than the Astrantias. It's only a USDA hardiness zone 7 to 9, but that's all UK winters and a lot of Northern Europe and parts of Canada and Australia too. Then there's Bergenia. Bergenia is indestructible and pollinator friendly. It's the first flower, apart from snowdrops, that comes out at the beginning of the year. And the flowers go on, and it doesn't seem to require any attention. I have got it planted under trees and beside walls, and it clumps out, and it has those really big structural leaves. Once again, when you look up Bergenia on the websites, it says that it needs moist, well-drained soil. But it has done here in this dry area in dry positions. So I'd advise giving it a try. It's quite hardy. It would do USDA hardiness zones 4 to 8, which means it goes to -25 Fahrenheit, but -28 centigrade. But apparently the leaves are less evergreen and less cold hardy at the really colder end of that. Cyclamen. Now here's a really pretty white flower. The white flower comes out in autumn and it has some really lovely heart-shaped leaves through the winter. They look really pretty with frost and it spreads very easily. And basically with cyclamen I'd suggest planting it, and if it's happy where it is, it'll spread, and if it's not, it won't. It'll make up its own mind. It is very hardy, but it is important not to mix it up with the florist cyclamen, which isn't very hardy, and that's usually sold in pots as an indoor plant. Euphorbia Robbaie, this does incredibly well and it romps around, it spreads by runners, so it pops up anywhere, and it has to be said that it is invasive in some places. Now the issue of invasive plants is that some plants that do well in some places then do too well in others, and if they escape into the countryside and they outcompete the local flora, then they can affect the animals and insects that live on that local flora. So invasive is a serious issue if it escapes into the countryside. It's less of a serious issue if it just romps around your garden a bit more than you would like. But it does vary from place to place, so you'll have to check what's invasive near you. Euphorbia Robbaie in the UK does spread easily, but it's not seen as invasive. I believe that in some United States states it is considered officially invasive. Fatsia japonica, it's very exotic looking, and it's another plant that's been really unfashionable in Britain for a long time, but it's very much coming back because it works so well in a sort of jungle environment. It has some big sculptural leaves, and some of them are variegated. It's not as hardy as some of the plants I've been mentioning. It's really a USDA zones 8 to 10, but you could bring it inside in the winter. It is in some places a house plant. But in the UK, it pretty much survives anything. And then there are ferns. There are so many varieties that there will be one for dry shade available where you are. So it's a question of researching that. Generally, the polysticum ferns and the Dryopteris ferns are considered to be the most drought resistant. I've had trouble getting ferns established in this garden, and I've now discovered that that's because even if they are very drought tolerant ferns, they do need to be well watered in their first season. And that's largely true for most plants, but I think particularly for ferns. So if you've had trouble getting them established, try watering them. I definitely think that for my mini woodland, ferns will be a good choice. Foxgloves. These are lovely tall spires of colour or white in late spring, and what I find with foxgloves is that they don't always do well when I plant them, but one gets established and it then self-seeds and it pops up all over the place, often in some very shady, miserable corners, and it is really pretty. So I think foxgloves like to do their own thing, but once they take off in your garden, that'll be fine. So they're worth a try. And they're pretty hardy. They're USDA zones 4 to 8, so that's anywhere in the UK. Then hardy geraniums. I think no dry shady corner can be without its hardy geraniums. And once again, there's a huge range, so it's a question of looking at what's around where you are and what's suitable and available for your dry shady corner. But generally macrorrhizum and phaeum are considered to be the most drought tolerant. They just clump out. They have delicate pretty flowers, often white soft pinks or bright vigorous pinks, and I've seen them look very good under trees and by walls. Geraniums, very hardy. It'll be USDA zones 5 to 9, any English winter, and quite a range of climates elsewhere. And I'd like to put in a word for ivy because it's so wildlife friendly. English ivy is invasive in some parts of the United States, and once again it's a question of finding out what is invasive near you. But if it isn't, it's a very good climber and it's good for ground cover. You can get some pretty variegated leaves and wildlife love it. It has flowers and fruit in the winter and it provides evergreen shelter. Obviously, it can spread quite a lot, even in the UK. It's generally agreed it doesn't damage buildings and trees as much as people thought it did, although it has to be said that it is important to cut it back at least once a year, and because once a year isn't very often, it's easy to forget that and then to suddenly discover it's shot up right into a tree or right up a building. And it really is a good plant as long as you keep it under control and don't plant it if it's invasive where you are. If you want to know more about shady gardens, then there's a Shady Gardens playlist at the end of this video. And do leave your suggestions for plants that do well in dry shade in your area in the comments below. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.